Picture this for a second, man. Hugh Jackman, yeah, Wolverine, Broadway legend, the guy who can sing, fight, cry on screen, and still come off as genuinely human. Now imagine looking at Hugh Jackman not just as a Hollywood icon, but through an Islamic Nazariya, an Islamic worldview. And it's wild when you do that because Islam has this deep respect for discipline, intention, struggle, and humility, and Hugh Jackman's whole persona kind of accidentally lines up with that in a really interesting way. This isn't about converting anyone or forcing a label on him. It's about recognizing patterns, values, and echoes of something ancient showing up in a modern human being. In Islam, there's this concept of niyyah, intention. Everything starts with intention. Not fame, not applause, not money, but why you do what you do. And when you hear Hugh Jackman talk about his work, his training, his respect for theater, his respect for co-stars, there's this obsessive sincerity. He doesn't phone it in. He treats acting like a responsibility, almost like an amana, a trust. Islam teaches that whatever role you're given in life, you're accountable for how honestly you carry it. Whether you're a leader, a worker, or an artist, you show up fully. That's something you see in him again and again. Then there's the idea of struggle, which in Islam is called jihad. Not the way people misuse it, but the real meaning. The internal struggle to become better, to control the ego, to push past weakness. Look at Hugh Jackman's physical transformations, sure, but more importantly, his emotional range. The guy isn't afraid to look broken on screen. Islam doesn't teach you to pretend you're perfect. It teaches you to acknowledge weakness and keep striving anyway. That constant self-discipline, that daily grind, that's deeply Islamic in spirit, even if it's not labeled that way. Another thing is humility. Islam constantly warns against arrogance, against thinking you're above others, and despite his global fame, Hugh Jackman has this reputation for being grounded, respectful, almost old-school polite. In Islam, character matters more than talent. You can pray all day, but if your character is trash, it means nothing. The Prophet Muhammad emphasized akhlaq, good character, over everything else. When people talk about Hugh Jackman being kind to fans, generous with colleagues, grateful for his journey, that resonates with that principle hard. And finally, there's purpose. Islam says humans aren't random. You're here for a reason, even if you don't fully understand it yet. When Hugh Jackman talks about storytelling, about bringing meaning, hope, or reflection to people's lives, it lines up with the Islamic idea that art, when done right, can remind people of truth, struggle, love, and mortality. Not preaching, not lecturing, just reflecting the human condition. So when you look at Hugh Jackman through an Islamic lens, you're not saying he represents Islam. You're saying that certain universal truths Islam talks about, discipline, intention, humility, struggle, and purpose, are so real that they show up in people across cultures. And that's powerful, because it suggests these values aren't confined to a religion, they're woven into what it means to be fully human. People hear the phrase, a bold prediction about Islam's role in humanity's future, and they immediately tense up, right? Like their shoulders go stiff, because religion plus future sounds like control, sounds like conflict, sounds like someone trying to force a belief system on a world that already feels exhausted. But that reaction itself is part of the story, because it shows how disconnected people have become from actually thinking deeply about systems that have survived thousands of years. We live in a time where everything is fast, disposable, customizable, where truth feels like an app you uninstall the moment it becomes uncomfortable. And in that kind of environment, anything ancient feels suspicious by default. But here's the thing that keeps looping in my mind. Ancient doesn't survive by accident. Nothing lasts that long without tapping into something real about human nature. When people talk about the future, they usually talk about technology, AI, space, bioengineering, all that stuff. And yeah, that's important, but what almost no one talks about is the internal state of human beings navigating all of this. Anxiety is through the roof. Depression is normal now. Loneliness is epidemic level. People have more freedom than ever and somehow feel more lost than any generation before them. That's not a coincidence. Unlimited choice without a moral center doesn't liberate people, it overwhelms them. And this is where the prediction starts to make sense, because Islam doesn't approach life from the angle of endless options. It approaches life from structure, boundaries, discipline, and purpose, and modern culture hates those words. even though it's quietly starving for them. Islam doesn't say, do whatever feels right today. It says, your feelings aren't the highest authority. That idea alone is explosive in a world where personal desires become sacred. It says there is a higher moral order, something above your impulses, your ego, your momentary emotions. And when people hear that, they think oppression, but psychologically, that's actually grounding. Humans don't function well when they are the ultimate judges of right and wrong. History proves that over and over again. When everything becomes relative, nothing feels solid, and when nothing feels solid, anxiety fills the gap. What's wild is that Islam predicted this kind of human confusion centuries ago. The idea that when people disconnect from remembrance, from accountability, from discipline, their hearts become restless. Not evil, not stupid, just restless. And look around. Restless is the perfect word for modern humanity. Always scrolling, always searching, always reinventing identity, always outraged, always distracted. The future isn't just about smarter machines, it's about whether humans can emotionally and morally survive the world they're building. And the bold part of the prediction isn't that Islam will dominate through power or numbers. That's lazy thinking. The bold prediction is that as systems collapse under their own contradictions, people will start paying attention to frameworks that don't rely on trends or moods. Islam doesn't chase modernity. It doesn't beg for relevance. It just exists, unchanged at its core. And that's either terrifying or fascinating depending on how honest you are about the state of the world, because when chaos becomes the norm, stability starts looking revolutionary, and when people finally admit that freedom without discipline is just another form of slavery, they begin looking for something that doesn't bend every time the cultural wind shifts, something that says there is meaning beyond consumption, beyond validation, beyond the self, and once that door opens even a little, the conversation about Islam stops being theoretical and starts becoming deeply personal, because then it's no longer about politics or headlines, it's about why so many people feel empty in a world that promised them everything and delivered confusion, and why a system built on prayer, restraint, accountability, and unity still speaks to something ancient inside the human psyche. Something that modern progress never managed to erase. Something that keeps resurfacing no matter how advanced society becomes, because beneath all the noise, humans are still humans, still searching for order and chaos, still asking the same questions they've always asked, just with better technology and less patience. And that's where this prediction stops sounding controversial and starts sounding inevitable, because the future doesn't just belong to innovation, it belongs to whatever can hold the human soul together when innovation alone isn't enough. And when you really sit with that idea, not just skim past it like another hot take, you start realizing that most civilizations don't collapse because they lack intelligence or technology. They collapse because they lose a shared moral language. People stop agreeing on what matters, what's sacred, what limits should never be crossed. Everything becomes negotiable. Truth becomes personalized. And when that happens, power replaces principle. Because if nothing is objectively right, then whoever shouts the loudest or controls the most resources gets to define reality. Islam operates on a completely different frequency. It doesn't ask society to invent morality in real time. It says morality is discovered, not created, and that alone challenges the core assumption of modern culture. What's fascinating is how Islam treats the individual and the collective as inseparable. Modern systems swing wildly between extreme individualism and forced collectivism, and both fail in different ways. Extreme individualism turns people inward until community dissolves. Forced collectivism crushes the soul. Islam doesn't do either. It tells you that you matter, your intentions matter, your private actions matter, but it also tells you that your behavior affects the whole, that your responsibility doesn't end at your own comfort. You pray alone, but you stand together. You're accountable for yourself, but you're also accountable to your community. That balance is rare, and it's something modern societies still haven't figured out. And here's where the future angle gets really interesting. As digital life expands, people are becoming more disconnected from physical community, from ritual, from shared experiences that ground them in reality. Everything is virtual, curated, filtered. Islam insists on physical acts of worship. You wash, You stand, you bow, you prostrate, at specific times, facing the same direction as millions of others. That's not random, that's embodiment, that's a system that understands. Humans aren't just minds floating in cyberspace, they need rhythm, they need routine, they need reminders that life isn't just about productivity or entertainment. Think about how radical that becomes in a future where people barely leave their homes, where AI does most tasks, where identity itself becomes fluid and unstable. In that environment, a religion that says 5 times a day, stop everything and remember why you exist starts looking less restrictive and more protective. It's like a firewall for the human soul, and people don't appreciate firewalls until the system gets hacked. Modern humanity is already hacked by addiction, distraction, and endless comparison, and the crazy part is that most people don't even realize it. They think this is normal. They think burnout is just adulthood. Islam also has a brutal honesty about human weakness. It doesn't pretend people are naturally perfect. It assumes you'll mess up. It builds in repentance, forgiveness, and reset. That's huge. Modern culture either shames people permanently or excuses everything. Islam does neither. It says you're responsible, but you're not hopeless. You're accountable, but the door is always open. That psychological framework is incredibly resilient. It prevents despair on one side and arrogance on the other. And as mental health crises continue to rise globally, systems that can stabilize the inner life without medication or constant external validation are going to matter more than anyone wants to admit. And then there's the idea of submission, which is probably the most misunderstood concept of all. People hear it and think weakness, loss of autonomy, blind obedience. But submission in Islam isn't to another human being, it's to a moral absolute that doesn't change based on trends or power structures. In a future where governments, corporations, and algorithms increasingly try to shape behavior, loyalty to something higher than all of them becomes a form of resistance. That's not regressive. That's dangerous in the most interesting way. It creates individuals who can't be fully owned, fully programmed, or fully bought, because their ultimate allegiance isn't up for negotia. So, when you zoom out and think long-term, like centuries, not election cycles, the prediction starts to feel less like a religious claim and more like a sociological one. Systems that regulate desire, anchor meaning, and preserve human dignity tend to outlast systems built on consumption and speed. Islam has already survived empires, colonialism, revolutions, and technological shifts without losing its core. That's not luck, that's design. And in a future where everything else feels temporary, where identities are constantly rewritten, where truth feels unstable, anything that offers permanence starts pulling people toward it, not because they're forced, but because they're exhausted, because at some point humanity stops asking, "What can I do?" and starts asking, "What should I do?" And the moment that question becomes central again, Islam is already there, already answering, already structured around that exact tension between freedom and responsibility, meaning and desire, individuality and unity, waiting in the background of human history while the world experiments with everything else. And you can't ignore how deeply this connects to power, not political power in the usual sense, but inner power, the kind that lets a person stay grounded when everything around them is unstable. Modern systems promise empowerment through choice, through expression, through visibility, but none of that actually teaches self-control. In fact, it often does the opposite. The more you indulge every impulse, the weaker your ability to resist anything becomes. Islam flips that entire idea on its head. It says real strength is restraint, real freedom is mastery over the self. And that's a message that sounds almost offensive to a culture built on instant gratification, but it's also a message that keeps proving itself true across time and psychology. Fasting is a perfect example. On the surface, it looks irrational, even unhealthy to people who've never tried it seriously. Why would you voluntarily deny yourself food and water? But anyone who's done it knows it's not about hunger. It's about reclaiming control. It's about reminding yourself that you are not your cravings. In a future where addiction to screens, stimulation, and comfort is only going to get worse, practices like fasting stop being religious quirks and start looking like survival tools. Islam doesn't wait for a crisis to teach discipline. It builds it into life before things fall apart. And then there's the economic side, which people rarely talk about honestly. Islam places hard moral limits on wealth accumulation, exploitation, and debt. It doesn't demonize money, but it refuses to let money becko. Me God. In a world drowning in inequality, where a handful of people control absurd amounts of resources while millions feel disposable, that framework is going to become increasingly relevant. Not as a slogan, but as a functioning ethical system. Mandatory charity, prohibition of exploitative practices, constant reminders that wealth is a test, not a reward. That creates a very different psychological relationship with success, one that reduces both arrogance and despair. What's wild is how modern conversations keep circling around problems Islam already addressed centuries ago: community breakdown, loss of purpose, sexual confusion, addiction, environmental responsibility. Islam doesn't treat these as isolated issues, it sees them as symptoms of imbalance, of humans placing themselves at the center instead of something higher. And whether people like that explanation or not, it keeps lining up with reality. When the self becomes the ultimate authority, the self collapses under that weight. Humans weren't designed to carry that kind of moral sovereignty alone. The future is also going to force hard questions about identity. When biology can be edited, when virtual realities feel more real than physical life, when social roles are constantly shifting, what anchors a person? Islam anchors identity in servitude to God, not in gender, race, class, or profession. That doesn't erase those things, but it stops them from becoming ultimate. In a future where identity crises become the norm rather than the exception, that anchoring could be the difference between coherence and fragmentation. People don't just need freedom to define themselves, they need limits that keep the self from dissolving entirely. And here's something that really messes with people's assumptions. Islam doesn't need to modernize to survive the future. That's the opposite of how most institutions operate. It doesn't update its core beliefs to stay relevant, it expects humans to mature into them. That's a bold stance. It assumes that truth isn't something we outgrow, but something we grow into. And if you believe that human nature hasn't fundamentally changed, that we're still driven by fear, desire, ego, and longing, just with better tools, then a system that was designed around those constants suddenly makes a lot of sense. You also can't separate Islam from its emphasis on remembrance, constant remembrance. Modern life is built around forgetting. Forgetting death, forgetting limits, forgetting consequences. Islam keeps death close, not in a morbid way, but in a clarifying way. It reminds you that time is finite, that actions echo beyond the moment. In a future obsessed with longevity, biohacking, and digital immortality, that reminder becomes even more radical. It cuts through the illusion that more time automatically equals more meaning. It forces a different question: what are you doing with the time you actually have? So when people hear a bold prediction about Islam's role in humanity's future, and immediately dismiss it as fantasy or fear-mongering, they're missing the deeper pattern. Religions don't influence the future only by converting masses. They influence it by shaping the moral vocabulary available to people when everything else starts to fail. And Islam's vocabulary is dense with accountability, restraint, unity, and purpose. As the world becomes louder, faster, and more fragmented, those qualities don't fade into irrelevance, they become rare. And anything rare in a collapsing system becomes valuable, not because it's trendy, but because it works, because it speaks to pressures humans haven't escaped despite all their progress. Pressures that are only intensifying as the future accelerates and demands more from minds and hearts that are already etched thin. And there's another layer to this that people usually avoid because it makes them uncomfortable. The idea that not everything new is progress, and not everything old is obsolete. Modern culture has this built-in assumption that time automatically equals improvement, like humans are on some guaranteed upward moral trajectory just because technology advances. But history doesn't actually support that. It shows cycles: rise, stability, decay, collapse, repeat. What changes is the tools, not the temptations. Islam never bought into the myth of inevitable progress. It assumes humans are capable of incredible good and incredible destruction at the same time, and that assumption alone makes it more realistic than most modern ideologies. Islam prepares people for power before giving it meaning. That's important. A lot of modern systems hand people power first and hope they'll figure out responsibility later. That doesn't work. When you give humans power without a moral framework, they abuse it every single time. Islam reverses that order. It drills humility, accountability, and submission into the individual long before authority or influence ever enters the picture. In a future where individuals may wield power once reserved for governments, through technology, influence, or data, that ethical conditioning becomes critical, because the danger isn't just tyrants anymore, it's ordinary people with extraordinary reach. You also can't ignore how Islam handles disagreement and difference. Despite the stereotypes, Islam acknowledges diversity as intentional, not accidental. Different tribes, languages, cultures, all existing within a single moral framework. Unity without uniformity. That's incredibly hard to achieve. Modern societies either fracture into identity silos or try to flatten differences entirely. Islam doesn't demand that everyone look the same or live identical lives. It demands alignment on core principles while allowing variation on the surface. In a future that's becoming increasingly global and interconnected, that model becomes more relevant, not less. And then there's law. People hate talking about law when it comes to religion because they immediately imagine cruelty or rigidity, but law exists whether people admit it or not. Every society enforces values. The question isn't whether there are rules, it's who decides them and why. Islam roots law in morality rather than convenience. It prioritizes protection of life, intellect, family, property, and dignity. Those priorities don't expire. They don't become outdated. As technology introduces new ethical dilemmas, cloning, AI consciousness, surveillance, genetic manipulation, societies will need moral anchors that aren't invented on the fly. Islam's legal philosophy wasn't designed for one century. It was designed for continuity. Another thing people underestimate is how Islam trains patience. Modern life is built around immediacy, instant results, instant outrage, instant validation. Islam is slow by design. It stretches actions across time. Daily prayer, yearly fasting, lifetime commitments. That slowness is actually a form of resistance against impulsive behavior. In a future driven by algorithms designed to hijack attention and provoke reaction, any system that trains humans to pause, reflect, and delay gratification is going to stand out as protective rather than restrictive. And there's something deeply subversive about Islam's relationship with success. It doesn't measure a person by output alone, it measures intention. Two people can do the same action, and one is elevated while the other is not, based purely on inner state. That messes with modern productivity culture, which only values what can be quantified. In a future where humans compete with machines that outperform them in speed and efficiency, systems that value intention over output will preserve human dignity in a way performance-based models never can. Islam also refuses to let suffering be meaningless. It doesn't romanticize pain, but it doesn't reduce it to randomness either. It frames hardship as a test, a purifier, a real part of the human experience. Modern culture either tries to eliminate all discomfort or medicates it into numbness. Neither approach prepares people for reality. Suffering is unavoidable. The difference is whether it destroys you or shapes you. Islam offers a narrative where pain has context, where patience isn't passive but powerful. As the future brings climate stress, displacement, economic instability, that narrative becomes psychologically stabilizing. So when you step back and look at the long arc, the prediction about Islam's role in humanity's future stops sounding mystical and starts sounding practical. It's not about domination, it's about durability. It's about which systems produce humans who can survive pressure without losing their humanity. Technology will keep accelerating, social norms will keep shifting. But the human nervous system hasn't upgraded. Anxiety, fear, desire, ego, those remain constant. Islam speaks directly to those constants. It doesn't flatter them, it disciplines them. And in a future that will demand more resilience than any generation before, that discipline could quietly become one of the most valuable currencies on the planet. Not because it's loud, not because it forces itself into the spotlight, but because when everything else feels unstable, people naturally gravitate toward whatever helps them stand still in the middle of the storm. And there's something else that almost never gets talked about in these conversations: the way Islam treats truth itself. Modern culture treats truth like a negotiation, like something flexible that adapts to consensus or emotion. If enough people feel a certain way, it becomes true. Islam doesn't operate on that logic. It treats truth as independent of human approval. Whether people like it, reject it, ignore it, or misunderstand it, truth remains truth. That idea alone is deeply unsettling in a future built on perception management, narrative control, and algorithmic influence, because it suggests that no amount of repetition can turn falsehood into reality. Think about where information is headed. Deepfakes, AI-generated content, virtual identities, simulated experiences that feel real enough to override memory. In that environment, the line between real and artificial starts to blur. Islam insists on grounding reality in something transcendent, something not subject to manipulation. It constantly pulls people back to a source that can't be edited, upgraded, or rebranded. That grounding becomes critical when sensory experience itself becomes unreliable. People won't just be confused about politics or culture, they'll be confused about what's real, and systems that anchor truth outside of human systems will suddenly feel less archaic and more necessary. Islam also doesn't outsource morality to experts or elites. Every individual is responsible. You don't get to hide behind institutions or trends. You're accountable for what you consume, what you say, what you do in private. That kind of personal moral responsibility is rare, and it's uncomfortable, but it's also empowering. In a future where people increasingly blame systems, algorithms, or social conditions for their behavior, Islam pushes back and says, you still choose. Circumstances matter, but they don't erase agency. That balance between compassion and accountability is hard to maintain, and most systems fail at it, but Islam has kept that tension alive for centuries. Another thing that makes this prediction unsettling for people is how Islam reframes success and failure over time. It doesn't judge life by peaks, it judges consistency, showing up again and again, doing small acts with sincerity. That's boring by modern standards. There's no viral moment in consistency. But consistency is exactly what sustains civilizations. In a future obsessed with moments, spikes, trends, and disruptions, a system that values steady moral behavior over dramatic gestures quietly builds people who don't collapse when attention moves on. And then there's the global angle. Islam already exists across cultures, languages, races, and economic conditions. It doesn't belong to one geography or ethnicity. That matters in a future where borders become more porous, migration increases, and cultural mixing intensifies. Islam doesn't require cultural erasure to function. It adapts at the surface while preserving its core. That flexibility without dilution is rare. Most systems either fracture or dissolve when they expand. Islam has shown it can scale without losing coherence, which is exactly what a global future demands. There's also the relationship Islam has with nature, which is surprisingly relevant. It treats humans as stewards, not owners. You don't dominate the earth. You're responsible for it. Waste is condemned. Excess is discouraged. Balance is emphasized. Modern environmental movements often frame responsibility as a trend or political identity. Islam frames it as worship. That's a deeper motivator. When responsibility is tied to accountability beyond human courts, behavior changes at a more fundamental level. As environmental crises escalate, systems that motivate restraint without relying on enforcement become increasingly valuable. And you can't ignore how Islam handles death. Modern society hides it, delays it, distracts from it. Islam confronts it regularly, remembers it daily, not to create fear, but to create perspective. In a future chasing immortality through technology, that grounding could be a corrective force. When death is acknowledged, life becomes sharper. Choices matter more, ego shrinks. When death is denied, people either panic or numb themselves. Islam doesn't let either extreme take over. It integrates death into life in a way that stabilizes the psyche. So when people hear a bold prediction about Islam's role in humanity's future and assume it's about numbers or dominance, they're missing the deeper mechanism. Influence doesn't always look like control. Sometimes it looks like providing the language people reach for when their own systems stop making sense. Islam already has that language. It's been refining it for centuries, waiting not for humanity to become more advanced, but for humanity to become more honest about its limitations, its fragility, its need for boundaries, meaning, and something higher than itself, especially when the future starts demanding answers that technology alone can't provide. And one of the most overlooked aspects of all this is how Islam deals with time itself. Modern life treats time like a resource to be exploited, optimized, squeezed until there's nothing left. Every second has to produce something, generate value, create output. Islam treats time as a trust, something you'll be questioned about, not something you own. That changes how a person moves through life. It slows you down just enough to notice what matters. In a future where people feel constantly behind, constantly rushed, constantly insufficient, a worldview that reframes time as meaningful rather than scarce becomes psychologically stabilizing. Prayer isn't just spiritual in that sense. It's temporal. It cuts the day into sacred intervals. No matter who you are, what you're doing, how important you think you are, time interrupts you. That's humbling. It reminds you that you're not the center of the universe. In a future driven by self-importance, personal brands, and endless self-promotion, being regularly interrupted by something higher than your ambition becomes a form of grounding that no productivity system can replicate. There's also the way Islam treats knowledge. Modern culture worships information. More data, more access, more content. Islam prioritizes wisdom over accumulation. Knowledge without action is considered a burden, not a virtue. That's a brutal standard. It means you're accountable for what you know. In a future where people consume endless information without integrating any of it, that standard becomes confrontational. It forces a question most people avoid. What have you actually become as a result of what you know? And then there's humility. Not performative humility, not social media humility, but actual recognition of limits. Islam constantly reminds humans that they don't see the full picture, that there's a wisdom beyond immediate understanding. Modern culture struggles with that idea because it equates not knowing with weakness. But real resilience comes from accepting uncertainty without losing direction. As the future introduces problems too complex for any one person or ideology to solve, humility stops being a flaw and starts being a survival trait. Islam also does something unusual with power structures. It decentralizes spiritual authority. There's no single human figure who represents God on earth. That matters. It limits corruption. It prevents blind obedience to individuals. In a future where charismatic leaders, influencers, and AI-generated personas can manipulate masses, a system that insists your relationship with the divine is personal, direct, and not owned by anyone else becomes quietly anti to control. That resistance isn't loud, it's internal, and internal resistance is the hardest to break. Another layer people underestimate is how Islam frames struggle. Life isn't supposed to be easy. Struggle isn't a glitch, it's the point. That framing alone reduces shock when hardship comes. Modern culture sells comfort as the default and treats difficulty as failure. That sets people up for collapse when reality hits. Islam prepares people for difficulty before it arrives. It normalizes effort, patience, endurance. In a future defined by rapid change, instability, and pressure, people trained to expect struggle are less likely to break under it. And then there's the emphasis on intention again, which keeps coming back because it's central. Islam judges actions by intention, not just outcome. That's huge in a world obsessed with results. In the future, outcomes will be increasingly influenced by systems beyond individual control. Algorithms decide reach, machines decide efficiency, markets decide value. If human worth becomes tied only to outcomes, most people lose. Islam protects human dignity by locating value in intention, something no machine can replicate or measure. So when you think about Islam's role in the future, it's not about competing with technology. It's about compensating for its side effects. Technology amplifies human capacity, but it also amplifies human weakness. Islam was built with human weakness in mind. It doesn't assume people will behave well if given enough freedom or comfort. It assumes they need guidance, reminders, boundaries. That assumption might sound pessimistic, but it's actually compassionate because it meets humans where they are instead of where ideologies wish they were. And as the future keeps accelerating, as life becomes more abstract, more virtual, more detached from physical and communal reality, systems that embodiment, discipline, remembrance, and accountability become anchors. Not because they're nostalgic, but because they address parts of the human condition that don't evolve at the same pace as technology. The body still needs rhythm. The mind still needs meaning. The soul still needs orientation. Islam speaks to all three simultaneously, without apology, without dilution, without rushing to keep up, standing there like a reference point while the world spins faster around it. And here's where it gets even more intense. You start looking at modern society, and you see everyone chasing novelty for its own sake, trends, attention, likes, validation, distraction, constant dopamine hits. And for a long time, it works superficially. People feel busy, entertained, stimulated, but underneath it all, there's emptiness. That emptiness doesn't go away just because technology gets faster. In fact, it grows. Faster communication, more information, more influence, more comparison only amplifies the sense of lack. That's exactly the point where a system like Islam becomes more than just a religion. It becomes a framework for surviving the internal vacuum that modernity creates, and it's subtle. It doesn't scream, it doesn't demand conversion. It quietly exists as a map. It tells people, you can be guided by principles that aren't dependent on temporary trends or the latest cultural fad. You can live a life where actions have weight beyond immediate gratification. In a future that's going to accelerate even more, where life is constantly streamed, mediated, and optimized by forces most people don't fully understand, that kind of unchanging map will feel revolutionary without anyone needing to declare it. Think about mental stability. Modern life is chaotic and overstimulating, and people are losing their ability to self-regulate. Anxiety, depression, burnout, they're all rampant. Islam builds in systems of regulation. Prayer regulates attention. Fasting regulates desire. Reflection regulates ego. Accountability regulates morality. Humans aren't designed to navigate life without internal systems like these, so when the future creates more pressure, more complexity, more illusion, systems that teach internal regulation are going to stand out. And then there's the global dimension again. Islam has already scaled across continents, languages, cultures. It doesn't collapse under diversity. Modern ideologies often fracture as soon as you try to export them. But Islam's core principles work anywhere because they address fundamental human nature, not just surface-level behaviors. That's why, in the future, as populations mix, migration increases, digital spaces merge cultures in unprecedented ways, a system that is inherently adaptable without losing core integrity will naturally become relevant. It's not a matter of conquest, it's a matter of design. Another aspect is resilience under pressure. History shows that civilizations fail not because they weren't clever or strong, but because they were internally fragile. Internal moral and social cohesion breaks down. Islam invests in internal cohesion at the individual level, then scales it collectively. You pray alone, you act morally alone, but your actions ripple outward. That ripple effect stabilizes communities in ways modern ideologies rarely account for. And in a future where social structures are under unprecedented stress, resilience will be priceless. And you can't underestimate the psychological comfort it provides. Humans have always sought meaning in chaos. Modernity removed almost all natural anchors, rituals, shared stories, communal frameworks, and replaced them with distraction and entertainment. People can't escape themselves through technology forever. Eventually, they okay for systems that offer coherence, a narrative that situates the individual in a larger order. Islam provides that, not artificially, not as propaganda, but as a lived framework that's been practiced for centuries. Then there's the predictive power of its moral design. Human nature is remarkably constant. Desire, fear, ego, longing, they don't change across centuries. Technology changes, politics change, culture changes, but these psychological constants persist. Islam's framework anticipates these constants. It doesn't rely on changing humans, it works with humans as they are. That's why a prediction about its future role doesn't feel like a guess. It feels inevitable because human nature doesn't fundamentally change. And lastly, for this section, consider the idea of accountability. Modern life often allows people to hide behind anonymity, systems, or technology. Actions have fewer immediate consequences. In a future dominated by virtual interactions, that problem will worsen. Islam insists on accountability, both private and public. You can't hide from it. That's revolutionary because it's not performative, it's structural. It creates humans capable of navigating life responsibly, even when external structures fail or become corrupt. That capability will be increasingly rare and increasingly valued as the world continues to accelerate beyond traditional oversight mechanisms. And then you have to think about the way Islam teaches patience over time. Modern society treats patience like a relic, something you tolerate when you have no choice, not as a skill to cultivate. Everything today is instant. Instant news, instant validation, instant gratification. People forget that real resilience requires delay, requires endurance. Islam embeds patience into life constantly. Daily prayer, fasting, seasonal rituals, long-term commitments. In a future where everything moves faster and faster, people who have practiced patience for centuries already have a psychological edge. They can wait. They can endure. They can make decisions without panic. And it's not just individual patience. It's societal patience. Communities are trained to tolerate diversity, to manage conflict, to remain cohesive despite pressures. Modern societies fail at that constantly because they try to shortcut human nature. They think laws or enforcement alone can hold people together. Islam knows it's not enough. Real cohesion comes from internalized values, shared rituals, and mutual accountability. In a future where social cohesion will be tested by migration, climate stress, and digital fragmentation, these systems of internal and communal patience will be priceless. Then there's the concept of humility, which gets lost in translation in modern discussions. Humility is not weakness, it's recognition of limits, acknowledgement that you don't have the full picture. Modern culture equates uncertainty with failure, but Islam trains people to live with uncertainty without collapsing. Humans will never know everything. Life will never be perfectly predictable. By building humility into daily life, Islam equips people to navigate complexity without breaking down. That skill is going to be critical in a future defined by rapid technological, social, and environmental change, and accountability keeps coming back because it's central. Modern systems externalize responsibility, blame the algorithm, blame the government, blame your circumstance. Islam internalizes responsibility. You are accountable for your actions, your choices, your intentions. That internal moral compass is like a stabilizer in stormy seas. In a future where external systems will increasingly fail or behave unpredictably, people trained to navigate life with internal accountability will naturally be resilient, more capable, more stable. Consider also the way Islam balances individuality and community. Modern ideologies swing between extremes, total individualism or forced collectivism. Islam integrates both. You are responsible for yourself, your intentions, your actions, but your behavior also affects the community. That balance cultivates mature, socially aware humans. In the future, as communities become more global, more interconnected, and more digitally mediated, the ability to manage personal responsibility while considering collective outcomes will be rare and valuable. And the concept of equality, radical equality, is built into the system. In a future increasingly stratified by wealth, access, and influence, the principle that everyone stands equally in moral accountability, that status, race, or wealth does not confer moral superiority, will act as a stabilizing force. People trained in that principle will resist the kind of extreme division that destabilizes modern societies. Islam also teaches that hardship has meaning. Modern culture treats discomfort as a glitch to eliminate. Islam treats it as a teacher. Trials, suffering, and challenge are embedded into the human experience as opportunities for growth, purification, and reflection. In a future defined by environmental crises, migration, and technological disruption, this mindset will prevent despair, reduce burnout, and sustain communities under pressure. And finally, Islam's predictive insight comes from centuries of observing human nature. Technology and politics change. Fashion, norms, and entertainment change. Human psychology doesn't. Desire, fear, ego, longing, they persist. Islam was built around these constants, not around transient trends. That's why predictions about its role in humanity's future feel less like speculation and more like an inevitability, because the pressures humans will face are timeless, and the framework has already anticipated them, quietly, persistently, structurally, without fanfare, waiting for the moment the world starts demanding answers that current systems cannot provide. And here's another piece most people miss: the way Islam deals with identity. Modern life is obsessed with identity politics. self-definition, and constantly changing social labels. That creates confusion, instability, and anxiety. Islam doesn't erase identity. It acknowledges language, culture, and background, but it places them within a higher framework. Your ultimate identity isn't defined by status, race, or personal achievement. It's defined by your alignment with moral principles, with purpose, with accountability. In a future where identity will be increasingly fluid, virtual, and decentralized, having a grounding in values that transcend surface differences will be a stabilizing force. And this links to belonging. Humans naturally crave community, coherence, and recognition. Modern life offers superficial communities, likes, followers, fan groups, but these lack depth, moral grounding, and shared responsibility. Islam offers belonging that is deeply structured. You participate in rituals, follow shared ethics, and contribute to the community in meaningful ways. That structure produces psychological safety even under stress. In a future dominated by digital relationships and fragmented social networks, systems that produce authentic belonging will become increasingly attractive and resilient. There's also the issue of moral clarity. In a world of moral relativism, people are constantly unsure what is right or wrong. That uncertainty leads to inaction, frustration, and exploitation by those who manipulate narratives. Islam provides a clear moral framework that integrates law, ethics, and personal accountability. That clarity becomes invaluable in a future where ethical dilemmas will multiply, from AI decision-making to genetic engineering to environmental crises. People trained to navigate life with a moral compass will stand out, not because they dominate, but because they can make coherent decisions in chaotic circumstances. And patience comes back again, but at a societal scale. Islam teaches communities to endure trials together, to coordinate, to balance individual and collective needs over time. That's rare in modern systems, where communities fracture under stress or overreact to perceived injustice. In a future defined by constant pressure, from climate events to migration to global political instability, this learned patience will prevent collapse and maintain cohesion. Another layer is the treatment of wealth and resources. Modern society promotes accumulation, consumption, and competition at extreme levels. Islam sets limits, encourages sharing, and frames resources as trusts, not entitlements. That moral structure promotes sustainability, reduces greed-driven inequality, and encourages responsibility. In a future where resource scarcity may become critical, systems that embed ethical stewardship into human behavior will have immense value. And the way Islam treats education and knowledge is critical. Knowledge isn't just collected, it's integrated, applied, and tied to ethics. Information alone isn't wisdom. That principle protects humans in a future where data will overwhelm perception, where algorithms generate endless content, and where information will no longer guarantee insight. Systems that teach discernment and ethical application of knowledge will outperform those that teach only accumulation. Finally, Islam's approach to human desire and regulation matters. Modernity has largely externalized control of desire to entertainment, consumerism, or immediate gratification. Islam internalizes. Desire is managed through ritual, reflection, and accountability. That builds self-control. And in a future where technology will tempt humans constantly, from immersive simulations to hyper-personalized experiences, individuals trained in self-regulation will have a unique advantage, a resilience that cannot be outsourced or simulated. And when you think about community again, Islam doesn't just tell individuals how to behave, it creates networks of accountability. Every action is observed, not in a surveillance sense, but in a moral and social sense. You're reminded that your choices ripple outward. Modern societies fail at this because they rely on law alone, or virtual enforcement, or social pressure that's inconsistent. In a future where digital influence can amplify harm faster than ever, systems that train people to internalize accountability will act like shock absorbers, preventing breakdowns before external enforcement is even possible. Then there's the dimension of rhythm. Humans are biological creatures. Circadian rhythms, cycles of work and rest, patterns of action and reflection. These are embedded in Islam through prayer, fasting, and seasonal rituals. Modern life ignores these natural rhythms, replacing them with screens, deadlines, and artificial stimulation. In a future that accelerates these disruptions, any system that respects and reinforces natural human cycles will provide an edge for mental stability, emotional regulation, and social cohesion. And the way Islam treats suffering is radical compared to modern culture. We treat suffering as a problem to eliminate. Islam treats suffering as a teacher. Hardship isn't meaningless, it's informative, shaping character and perspective. In a future filled with crises, from climate upheaval to economic shocks, this mindset prevents despair, reduces burnout, and cultivates resilience at a societal SCA. People who internalize this approach will be able to navigate instability without collapse. There's also the element of memory. Modern life is distraction-heavy, and forgetting has become default. Islam insists on remembrance of God, of mortality, of ethical obligations, of community responsibilities. Regular practices reinforce these memories, which keeps values alive in everyday decision-making. In a future of constant sensory overload, remembering what matters will be a rare skill, and it will separate those who endure from those who drift. And then there's the treatment of intention. Modern systems judge success by outcome, by metrics, by visibility. Islam emphasizes intention first. That creates a resilience that outcome-based cultures can't provide. If outcomes fail, the inner moral structure still functions. In a future dominated by unpredictable external systems, AI, economic volatility, environmental uncertainty, this internal focus on intention will preserve dignity and guide decisions when external signals fail. Another aspect is humility, which is trained repeatedly in Islam. Humility here is not weakness, it's recognition of limits, acknowledgement of mortality, and an acceptance that human understanding is always partial. Modern culture equates not knowing with incompetence, but humility allows people to navigate uncertainty without collapse. In the coming decades, when problems will exceed any individual's understanding, humility will be a rare but critical survival trait, and resilience at the community level comes from shared rituals, shared responsibility, and shared moral frameworks. Modern communities often fracture under pressure because they rely on superficial cohesion or coercion. Islam cultivates cohesion internally, making communities structurally resilient. In a future of migration, environmental stress, and technological transformation, communities built on these principles will adapt more successfully than those relying solely on convenience or coercion. Finally, for this section, consider how Islam bridges individual and collective success. It doesn't isolate one from the other. Individual moral development directly benefits collective stability. That integration creates feedback loops of accountability, ethics, and cohesion that modern systems rarely achieve. And as the future grows more complex, with systems of influence, technology, and interconnected risks, these feedback loops will become indispensable, quietly guiding humans to survive pressures that would overwhelm purely individualistic or purely collective structures. And another thing people miss is how Islam positions humans in relation to time and history. Modern life treats time as linear, disposable, something to optimize or monetize. Islam embeds humans within a larger temporal framework. Life is finite, actions have consequences, and patterns of behavior echo across generations. That long-term perspective teaches foresight and responsibility in a way modern culture rarely does. In a future where decisions have far-reaching consequences, climate, technology, societal structures, humans who are trained to consider long-term effects will naturally make more sustainable choices. Then there's the emphasis on ethical consistency. Modern systems are reactive. Ethics shift based on public opinion, market forces, or convenience. Islam teaches that principles are constant. Actions are judged by a framework that doesn't bend for trends or popularity. That consistency becomes increasingly rare in a world of constant change. In the future, when societies are destabilized by rapid technological, social, environmental shifts, having a moral framework that remains intact will allow communities and individuals to navigate uncertainty without moral collapse. And consider the integration of individual and collective responsibility again. Modern culture often separates the personal from the social. You're either focused on yourself or forced into collectivism. Islam integrates both. You're responsible for your intentions, actions, and growth, but those actions ripple into the community. That dual accountability builds resilience, cooperation, and stability, which will be invaluable in a future marked by complexity, interdependence, and global crises. Then there's ritual as a stabilizing factor. Prayer, fasting, charity, pilgrimage, all of these create predictable patterns that structure daily and annual life. In a future dominated by unpredictability, those rituals will serve as anchors. Humans thrive with patterns. Even the brain itself responds better when life has rhythm. Islam embeds that rhythm systematically, without relying on external enforcement, making it a deeply sustainable model. And humility keeps returning because it's essential. Life will always confront humans with uncertainty, challenges, and limitations. Modern culture often treats this as failure or weakness. Islam treats it as opportunity for growth, reflection, and perspective. That mindset will become increasingly critical in a future where technological, environmental, and societal pressures will challenge human assumptions constantly. Then consider knowledge and application. Modern education emphasizes acquisition. Islam emphasizes integration. Knowledge without action is incomplete. This creates humans capable of ethical application, not just accumulation. In a future flooded with information, distinguishing useful, applied knowledge from noise will be a survival skill. Systems that cultivate that will naturally influence outcomes, even quietly, without needing to dominate. And the ethical regulation of desire is key. Modernity externalizes desire, entertainment, consumption, instant gratification. Islam internalizes it, teaching humans to govern themselves. That skill will matter more than ever in a future where technology constantly exploits impulses. People trained in self-regulation will navigate temptation, distraction, and manipulation with resilience, preserving mental stability and moral integrity. Finally, the prediction's boldness isn't about conquest. It's about durability, internal cohesion, and relevance. Systems that survive future pressures are those that anticipate human constants, desire, fear, ego, longing, while providing tools to navigate them responsibly. Islam was designed around these constants. Technology, politics, trends, they'll fluctuate, but human nature remains remarkably consistent. That's why this prediction feels inevitable, because it aligns with unchanging patterns of the human psyche. And then there's the element of global applicability. Modern ideologies often fracture when expanded beyond their origin culture. Islam, despite misconceptions, has historically functioned across continents, languages, and ethnicities. Its core principles are adaptable at the surface but immutable at the core. That scalability without losing integrity is going to be critical in a future where populations are mobile, cultures increasingly mix, and digital spaces flatten geography. People naturally gravitate towards systems that can provide stability without demanding uniformity. Think about mental and emotional resilience. Modern systems externalize coping. Therapy, medication, distractions, entertainment. Islam internalizes it through structured practices, reflection, and accountability. That creates individuals and communities capable of withstanding crises without external props. In a future of environmental, social, and technological upheaval, that inner resilience will differentiate those who collapse from those who endure. And it's not just individual resilience. Collective resilience comes from rituals, shared ethics, and integrated accountability. Modern societies often fail because cohesion relies on convenience or coercion, rather than internalized moral structure. Islam trains people to uphold the collective while honoring individuality. That balance is rare, and it becomes increasingly valuable as global pressures rise. There's also the role of intention over outcome. Modern culture prioritizes visible success and measurable results. Islam judges by intention, which preserves dignity and moral guidance even when external circumstances fail. In a future dominated by algorithmic, economic, and environmental unpredictability, internal measures of value will be more sustainable than any external metric.